say that the internet is written in pen, not in pencil. It's very true. Articles I wrote 5 years ago, 10 years ago about Buddhist philosophy, people still discover them today for the first time. In theory, videos I have here on YouTube about Buddhist philosophy, about veganism, about politics, but anything else, people can at any time stumble upon. And I sometimes get email pertaining to particular projects I did years ago. Sometimes those projects were very short-lived. Then I studied a particular language, etc. And, when people are Googling for that stuff, I may be one of the few sources they can find. So it is true I gained some level of notoriety or micro-fame for my challenging views on Buddhist philosophy, Buddhist history, Buddhist politics, textual study, especially of Theravada Buddhism. What I have to say about Mahayana Buddhism is even more controversial, but let's not get into that in this video. So I got an email today from a guy named John. I just use first names normally when I reply to emails, unless the person tells me they want me to promote their website or something. I'll just use their first name. So John wrote to me and says, "Dear Eisel, I became interested in Buddhism about a year ago and have been engaging in meditation practice since that time. I very much enjoyed your YouTube videos, particularly those that pertain to Buddhism. It is refreshing to hear an honest and cogent rebuttal of the drivel that Western Buddhist neophytes are forced to endure. Perhaps an ineluctable consequence of geography and language." So anyway, obviously a very sympathetic statement, sympathetic to my view of the world that he states there. But of course, the other elephant in the room is not geography and language; it's colonialism. Right? Imagine our whole engagement with Buddhism would be very different if India had conquered parts of Europe, and it wasn't instead the case that Europe conquered parts of India. Buddhism could have come to Europe under very different circumstances, but really the European rediscovery of Buddhism, the influential, more recent discovery of Buddhism, because we do have centuries and centuries of contact with India and Buddhism, was above all else the British Empire conquering bits and pieces of India. It could have come to us from the Portuguese, it could have come to us from the Spanish or the Dutch, but no, it really was the British Empire's adventure in India. So yeah, that's the missing leg of the stool here. Geography, language, brute force, colonialism. Indeed, so continuing to quote this email to me, "Indeed, I share your contempt for the North American bastardization and unabashed exploitation of Buddhism. I'm currently reading Richard Gombrich's book on the social history of Theravada Buddhism. It has influenced my perception of Buddhism as well as the way I think about meditation practice." The only book I recommend by Richard Gombrich is his very first book, Precept and Practice, in the highlands of Sri Lanka, highlands of Ceylon. That is a good book. I do not recommend any of his later books. Sorry, Richard. I know Richard. I think he's a great guy. As a personality, I think he's a wonderful dinner companion. I think he's great company. A lot of people feel the opposite. A lot of people feel he's a good scholar, but is scary to eat dinner with. But maybe that's because you're a fraud, and maybe that's because he calls you out for being a fraud. One of the things I love about Richard is that he calls people out for being a fraud. My kind of guy. But his first book is a classic. His later books, I cannot recommend. So it is. I continue to read this email. "I am interested in learning more about your views on meditation and the lack of benefits thereof. My own uneducated perspective is that meditation was never intended as a prescription for happiness." Ding ding, correct. "Instead, I see it as a long-term process whose objective is related to seeing truth through realizing the three characteristics." So, obviously I'm interrupting my reply to this email. One of the crucial phrases in the Pali Canon is tearing up desire by its roots. So it depends on what you mean by the word happiness. The outcome of meditation, I'll come back to this in a minute, meditation is really the wrong word to use in Buddhism, but that's the word we use in English. The outcome of meditation in Buddhism is tearing up desire by its roots, which is to say not just destroying desire short term, not just satisfying your desires, but in some sense crippling your ability to feel desire so that you never again feel, for example, sexual desire. And sexual desire is in some ways the most powerful or most important example in this religious context, because these are men who are supposed to be living in celibacy, and not just living in celibacy, but they're not even tempted by sex. Now, within the Pali Canon, there's a fair bit of evidence that many of the monks were tempted by sex, if you include the Vinaya. But the idea is once you attain nirvana, you are tearing up desire by the roots. Now, that is dogmatically asserted to be the highest happiness, the truest happiness that you can attain in your life. So this is philosophy sensu stricto, this is philosophy in the clearest sense of the word philosophy. Philosophically, Buddhists were arguing that instead of gratifying your desires, instead of going through a perpetual process akin to, scratching an itch and then feeling an itch again, you are eliminating the cycle of desire and satisfaction and yearning. So it's like instead of feeling hungry and then feeling full, you're eliminating both by tearing up the root of desire. So where you don't feel appetite, and so you neither feel hungry nor full. But this is being extended to all the desires. So sexual desire, but also, for example, the desire of the eye to see beautiful things, the desire of the nose to smell pleasant smells. That is the principle of the thing, and they're arguing that that is the highest happiness. However, from a modern Western secular perspective, obviously that is not happiness. That's not the kind of happiness that a business executive is looking for to balance his busy schedule at the office. He's balancing his divorce and his girlfriend and, running back and forth between jobs and, visiting his kids in private school. The type of wealthy Western patron for Buddhism that the whole system is set up to flatter and entice and to get the money out of. That's the reality. When Buddhist monks are preaching to that sort of figure, they're not going to tell them that the happiness we're talking about here is completely incompatible with the life of a modern Western secular person. On the contrary, many, many monks, and this is even more obvious in Mahayana Buddhism, preach that Buddhism can improve your sex life, that it can help you deal with stress, that it can, help you with this kind of this quest for personal happiness in the midst of a life of bourgeois luxury and the busy distractions of a modern executive in the workplace, etc. So yeah, in that sense, it's complete bullshit. In another sense, it's like, well, what do you mean by the word happiness? Anyway, we continue. This guy, John, you've only been playing the Buddhist game for 1 year, but you're doing better than most, and I think that's because you didn't become a victim of one of these cult leaders, of whom there are plenty in the game. So he says, my own uneducated perspective is that meditation was never intended as a prescription for happiness. Indeed, I see it as a long-term process whose objective is related to seeing truth through realizing the three characteristics. As I've just said, that's part of the story. You also have to look at desire. There are other factors too. I'm not telling, this isn't a lecture on all the factors of connected to nirvana. There'll be a longer lecture. To this end, I've been reading Ajahn Brahm. So Ajahn Brahm is a modern person. He's not an ancient figure, for those of you who don't know. I acknowledge that his teaching is often condescending and even puerile, but I think he makes a convincing argument that jhana is essential. So jhana is Jhana. Jhana. Okay? The process is a long one, lifelong. I think this is at the heart of Western distaste of Eastern Buddhism. Quote, I want my big back and I want it now. So therefore, quote unquote, Vipassana practice is attractive to Westerners thanks to folks like Joseph Goldstein. No comment. They see it as a shortcut to nirvana. Based on what you've said in your videos, I realize that you are not so enamored of the currently prominent members of the Sangha. So it is with some trepidation that I ask you what your views are. So I'm just going to answer that one central point that he raises. He is asking me more broadly to comment, but we're keeping this video short. Yes, fundamentally, jhana is meditation. And anyone who tells you anything different is either lying to you intentionally or they're preaching out of ignorance. And that is a great shame. I think it is really unfortunate that in the English language we use the word meditation at all for what is supposed to happen in Buddhism, for the jhanas, as a translation for the jhanas. And how are we going to break it down? Look at how we've used the word meditation in English. There is a very famous book titled Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. So that is the English translation of the title of an ancient Roman book from the emperor Marcus Aurelius, and it was translated in English as Meditations. Another way to translate the title of that book would be Thoughts to Myself, so private thoughts, and that was translated as Meditations. So our concept of meditation in Marcus Aurelius, in Catholicism, in Western philosophy, has nothing to do with Buddhism. It has nothing to do with jhana or what this concept was. And then on the other hand, the vagueness of that idea of meditation has allowed people to play around with what concepts in ancient Pali, in ancient Chinese, or theoretically in ancient Sanskrit. Sanskrit's pretty useless, that's another story. But, in these ancient languages, what text you're drawing on and what you're interpreting as meditation. So there was one text that I thought was outrageously bad. There was a modern thesis and published as a book and endorsed by Richard Gombrich himself, as a matter of fact, but I'm not going to name the author. And it was hilarious. It was picking little bits and pieces of passages that had nothing to do with meditation and was misrepresenting them in English as if the topic being described had to do with meditation. So there's a very evocative image in the Pali Canon of the sharpness of a knife, where it's saying, and this is in ancient India, not modern steel, not modern going to a knife shop. But anyway, that in ancient India, when you look at the blade of a knife, you can't tell just by looking at it whether it is sharp or dull. You can't tell how sharp it is. It's in the practice of the thing. You have to use it. You have to cut something. So, like today, you can cut a piece of paper. I don't remember them giving an example, but cut a piece of grass or something to see whether or not the knife is truly sharp. But you can't tell just by looking at a blade, comparing a sharp blade to a dull blade or a well-honed blade to a not well-honed blade. It's a nice image. It's a nice poetic moment in a philosophical debate in Buddhism. But what they're debating actually has nothing to do with jhana and has nothing to do with meditation. So today, in English, it's very easy for a modern translator to take an image like that, misrepresent it, turn it into some kind of sexy, as he says, bastardized philosophy, and take so-called meditation a different way. So the fact that meditation, for one thing, to start with, it is a totally inappropriate concept. The Catholic idea of meditation is not appropriate to Buddhism at all, not at all. And then the sense in which it's used in ancient Greek philosophy and ancient Roman philosophy, which is, again, a modern English translation. It's not how the Greeks themselves or the Romans themselves said it, but how people in England in the last couple of centuries have used the word meditation in translating those philosophies into English. That also is not appropriate to Buddhism at all. And then finally, this is like a loose-fitting set of clothes. It never covers, and it never covers what you want to cover, and it never reveals what you want to reveal. And the much simpler reality is jhana. Why does nobody want to, why do extremely few people want to bluntly and honestly say what we mean by meditation is jhana? And when we talk about jhana, we're talking about meditation in Buddhist philosophy, because the descriptions of jhana are very precise and very clear what it means and what that experience is supposed to be, and it is in part a hallucinatory experience, and that basically puts you into the corner of having to admit, yes, reincarnation matters, yes, transcendental experience matters, yes, these specific visions that are described as progressing through the jhanas in the text, that matters. That's the crucial, central part of the Buddhist meditative experience. All of a sudden, this is something you can't easily repackage and sell to an executive or an architect who's going through his second divorce and is coming to a Buddhist temple wanting to donate money to the monks and looking for a flexible, pliant doctrine that's going to make his sex life better and improve his self-esteem and maybe make him feel like more of an intellectual, etc., but who has no interest in renouncing his sex life, renouncing all of his worldly possessions, shaving his head, becoming a Buddhist monk. He has no interest in tearing up desire by its roots. He has no interest in a meditative practice, the purpose of which is to destroy your ability to enjoy life. Now, Buddhists philosophically claim that this practice, it doesn't just destroy your ability to enjoy life, it also destroys the sorrow and suffering, which is, I think, easy for us to imagine. If you actually feel no hunger, feel no appetite, then you maybe do not suffer when you eat poorly, when you don't eat enough, etc. If you actually feel no attraction to the opposite sex, or no attraction to the same sex, then you don't suffer when you live in celibacy. Okay, so philosophically we can agree with that. How are you going to package that and sell that in 21st century California? Harder to do. How are you going to package and sell something like the jhanas, the experience of the jhanas, I set down in the text, where there's a very clear checklist in the ancient text of what this experience is supposed to be, whether you have it or don't have it. And even some very senior Buddhist monks who were, had the highest level of medals on their chest in Buddhism, they tend to get really uncomfortable when you actually talk specifically about the jhanas. Like, so have you or have you not experienced, these jhanas as they're set down in the text? So people keep it vague for a reason, right? People cling to the shadows and fog for, I think, some very clear reasons. That's really where, it's sort of a new superstition that modern Buddhists have tried to create. And at the same time, they're in a state of denial as to what the old superstitions, the old magical beliefs in Buddhism really were. And if we want to move forward in an authentic and honest way in Buddhism, we both have to acknowledge what ancient Buddhism was, and we have to acknowledge what we as people in the modern world can and cannot believe, maybe what use we can make of it. The way to honor Socrates, the way to honor Aristotle, is not to misrepresent their teaching as if they were more modern than they were. Let's appreciate what is ancient as ancient. Let's appreciate what is superstitious as merely superstitious. And in terms of philosophy, ultimately the challenge for Buddhism must be to produce a new philosophy. It cannot possibly be to rehash and misrepresent an ancient philosophy in a way that's going to sell more tickets or draw more donations or convince people that they have a better sex life thanks to some phony-ass, bastardized version of a meditative practice that was absolutely bound to a life of celibacy.